An old billionaire trapped in the routine of his silent mansion walks into the kitchen just after midnight. But there she is, his black maid, the quiet girl he never really saw studying under a flickering light. Medical textbooks spread around her like pieces of a life he never imagined. She dreams of becoming a doctor, and what he does next will change both of their lives forever. If you believe one quiet moment can rewrite everything, click subscribe and tell us what city you're watching from. Langford Hall did not make noise. It breathed in stillness, exhaled routine. It was a house built not for joy, but for function, where every door closed gently, every hallway seemed to apologize for its own length, and every room obeyed the architecture of silence. The marble floors weren't just polished, they gleamed like frozen water under the weight of symmetry. Chandeliers hung without flicker. The scent of lemon oil and distant lilies floated through the air vents like a polite ghost. No painting was crooked, no drawer ever stuck, and no curtain dared wrinkle. The entire estate felt like it had been designed not for people, but for control, a monument to the absence of friction. Frederick Harlow, its owner, was much the same. He was not a man shaped by warmth, but by discipline, an architect of silence, in both his home and his soul. 65, lean, sharp-featured, once formidable in the world of finance, now formidable only in the way he had retreated from it all. His eyes, once described as piercing, now merely watched. He didn't linger in conversation. He didn't welcome surprises. He moved with the same precision as the house, never rushing, never fumbling. Since Eleanor died, he had become a figure of habit rather than presence. She had been the color, the chaos, the contradiction to his order. When she left, the world did not collapse. It simply quieted. That night, like so many before it, Frederick woke at 2:15 a.m. He didn't need to check the time. His body had become a clock regulated by thirst, by grief, by a rhythm that made sense only to him. He rose from the bed slowly without reaching for the lamp and walked across the room. The carpet was soft beneath his feet. The hallway outside his suite was as it always was, dim, clean, untouched. He descended the main staircase without flipping the switch, letting the moonlight guide him as it filtered in through the tall windows. The house was dark except for one thing, a sliver of light beneath the kitchen door. He paused. That light wasn't supposed to be there. The staff retired at 10. It was an unspoken rule, not harsh, just absolute. No one entered the kitchen after hours, not because it was forbidden, but because it simply wasn't done. He walked toward the light slowly, not out of fear or suspicion, but habit. Langford Hall demanded stillness. Even he respected that. But when he reached the door and pushed it open, his steps faltered. The room was lit by a single overhead bulb casting a white, sterile glow over the marble countertops. At the center island sat Naomi. She was not preparing food. She was not cleaning. She wasn't wearing her uniform jacket, only a worn, oversized gray sweater over her blouse sleeves pushed up to her elbows. Her posture was slightly hunched, head bent over a spread of books and paper. There were at least 3 textbooks on the counter, along with a spiral notebook filled with slanted handwriting and a detailed diagram of a kidney sketched in blue and red ink. She hadn't heard him. Her lips moved slightly as she read aloud to herself, low and rhythmic like a chant. A pencil was tucked behind her ear. Her expression was pure concentration. Brow, furrowed jaw, tense eyes flicking back and forth across the page. Frederick stood in the doorway longer than he should have. There was something startling about the sight, not because it was wrong, but because it was so thoroughly out of place. Naomi, the housemaid who moved through the halls like a shadow, who never spoke unless spoken to, was here at 2:15 in the morning, not sleeping, not resting, but studying anatomy. She wasn't just reading. She was working, memorizing, wrestling with knowledge the way people wrestle with faith. And it stopped him cold. She looked up suddenly, sensing something, and her eyes met his. Wide, startled, dark. The kind of look that came from being caught, not in guilt, but in something intimate. She pushed back from the counter so quickly the stools screeched across the floor. I'm sorry, sir, she said, stumbling over the words. I wasn't expecting anyone. I'll clean up right away. Frederick raised one hand, silencing her gently. No, he said. You're fine. I was just getting water. She hesitated, unsure, then nodded. Her movements were fast but controlled, gathering her papers into a pile as if to hide them. You don't need to stop, he added, reaching for a glass from the cabinet. Please, go on. She froze, then slowly lowered herself back onto the stool. He filled the glass at the filtered tap, then turned to look at the materials spread before her. "What are you studying?" he asked, voice neutral. She hesitated, clearly debating whether to tell the truth. Her eyes dropped to her hands, which were now knotted together in her lap. Then quietly she said, "An entrance exam. For a pre-med program." He blinked. "You're applying to medical school?" She shook her head. "Not directly. It's an online bridge course. If I pass, I can qualify for a full-distance program. It's not a real medical school yet, but it could be, eventually." He glanced at the textbooks again. None of them were new. The pages were worn, annotated in the margins. One had a broken spine taped with electrical tape. There were colored pens, flashcards, even a printed list of Latin terms. "You want to be a nurse?" he asked, not unkindly, just because the question made sense. Naomi looked up. There was something in her eyes now, not defiance, not fear, but certainty. "A doctor," she said, her voice steady. He didn't answer. He wasn't sure he could. There was nothing in his world to compare this to, nothing that matched the image of a young black housemaid in his kitchen at 2 a.m., dreaming not of rest or escape, but of stethoscopes and surgery. He took a sip of his water. It was cold, clean, the kind of luxury that people forget is luxury. Then he set the glass down on the counter. "Don't let me disturb you," he said simply, and turned to leave. He reached the hallway, then paused just beyond the door, the sliver of light still visible on the floor behind him. He stared at it for a long time. Back in his room, he did not return to sleep. He stood at his window, arms crossed, watching the bare trees sway in the night breeze. Something in him had shifted. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't inspiration. It was something quieter, harder to name. Like a crack in ice he didn't realize had been forming until now. For the first time in years, he felt the silence in the house not as comfort, but as absence. Not as safety, but as something broken. And all of it began with that image. Naomi bent over a textbook in the middle of the night, writing a future no one had prepared her for. The next morning, Frederick Harlow sat longer than usual at the breakfast table. The eggs on his plate had gone cold, untouched. His coffee, once piping hot, sat lukewarm beside the folded newspaper he had not read. He stared absently across the sunlit room as the butler moved soundlessly through his duties, the clink of silverware against porcelain, the only sound breaking the thick, slow quiet. Nothing in the house had changed. The linen was crisp, the windows clean, the air scented faintly with jasmine from the greenhouse. Everything was as it should be. Yet something in him had shifted. A sliver of disruption, small but persistent, had lodged itself beneath the surface of his routine. He had seen Naomi the night before, truly seen her, and the image had settled in his thoughts like a stone dropped into still water. No splash, just ripples, continuous spreading. He hadn't expected to think about it again. He thought it would pass like most things did in a house built to insulate him from emotion. But it didn't. As he moved through the day, reviewing market briefs in his study, dictating a letter to his legal advisor, nodding absently at the gardeners pruning the west hedges, he kept seeing her. Not Naomi the housemaid, but Naomi the student hunched over her notes under the kitchen's stark light, eyes fixed on some invisible point ahead of her. She hadn't looked up seeking approval. She hadn't tried to explain. She had looked afraid, yes, but also purposeful. And that quiet conviction had disturbed something in him, not in a dramatic or sentimental way, but in a way that made the floor beneath his thinking feel just slightly less steady. Later that afternoon, he summoned Mrs. Lang, the house manager, a woman of sharp timing and softer tone. She had served the estate for over a decade and knew its inner workings better than most. When she entered the study, clipboard in hand, Frederick didn't look up immediately. He stared out the window, watching the trees shift in the breeze. Then he asked, almost casually, "How long has the girl Naomi been working here?" Mrs. Lang glanced down at her notes, though she didn't need to. 3 years and 4 months, sir. She came highly recommended from a family in Connecticut. Quiet, reliable, keeps to herself." He nodded once. "Family. She sends money home. Louisiana. I believe she has 2 younger siblings, possibly a grandmother. She doesn't talk much about them. Exceptionally private. No complaints." "None, sir. Never late, never causes problems. If I may say so, she's almost invisible." That word struck him. Invisible. It lingered longer than it should have, echoing in his chest in a way he couldn't explain, as if being invisible was something to be praised, as if it was a virtue. He dismissed Mrs. Lang with a nod and turned back toward the window. Outside, the ivy climbed the stone walls the same as it had yesterday and the day before, but inside he no longer felt quite so untouched. He began to notice things, small things, the way Naomi nudged the door softly so it wouldn't creak, the way she folded shirts with a kind of meditative care, not rushed, not mechanical, the way her eyes flickered ever so briefly toward the grand piano in the sitting room, resting there just a second longer before she turned away. One morning, as she dusted the library, he watched her fingertips linger over the spines of the books, not to straighten them, but to read the titles like each one called to her quietly. It reminded him of Eleanor. His wife had moved the same way when she thought no one was watching, soft hands brushing across words, across walls, across life itself. She had loved medicine once too. Not as a profession, but as a fascination. She used to read aloud strange medical facts while he reviewed spreadsheets late into the night. She had a way of turning the human body into poetry. The heart doesn't break, she once told him, but it does bruise. It was such a ridiculous thing to say, but he had remembered it. It came back now as he watched Naomi disappear down the corridor with a basket of folded linens. That night, he lingered again at the top of the stairs around the same time, 2:15. The house was dark except for one faint thread of light beneath the kitchen door. He didn't go in this time. He stood outside listening. There was the rustle of paper, the scratch of pen on notebook, and her voice, soft, steady, repeating anatomical terms with Louisiana twining around the Latin. Her tone wasn't loud or confident, but focused, driven. There was fatigue in it too, and urgency. He imagined her hands calloused from work, now tracing diagrams of lungs, hearts, muscles. She didn't know he was there. That made it more intimate, more honest. And it stirred something in him that had nothing to do with charity. He returned to his room but didn't sleep. He sat in his chair near the fireplace, the embers long gone cold, and stared at nothing. Eleanor's face hovered in his thoughts, not in grief, but in recognition. She would have seen Naomi. She would have asked her what she was reading, what she hoped for. Eleanor had always looked beyond the surface of people. Frederick had admired that once. Then over time he had learned to forget how. He had surrounded himself with systems, with loyalty, without question, with silence. But now the silence felt different. It felt heavy, watching. The following day, while passing the rear service corridor, he overheard Naomi on the phone. The door was ajar, her voice low, trembling. "No, I haven't told them. I can't lose this job, Mari. You know that. If I pass, maybe I'll get a scholarship. But if I fail, then what was it all for?" There was a pause, a catch in her throat. "Just pray for me, please. I don't have much time." He stepped away before she noticed him, something tight curling in his chest. He had heard desperation before on trading floors and boardrooms, but never like that. This was the desperation of someone who didn't just want more, but needed it. Someone who had never been given the luxury to dream loudly. That night, he opened his laptop. He searched for the program she had mentioned. It didn't take long to find. A state university's online pre-med curriculum, competitive, academically demanding. The entrance exam was intense. The tuition for accepted students was modest by his standards, but steep for someone like Naomi. There were no listed scholarships, just deadlines, requirements, numbers. He read through testimonials, browsed the course load. Then he closed the browser and sat in the dark, his hands resting loosely in his lap. He didn't know why he cared. Not fully. Maybe because for the first time in years he had been reminded of something real, not profitable, not strategic, but real. The look in Naomi's eyes that night hadn't been hope. It had been purpose, and it had shaken him more than he liked to admit. Over the next few days, he watched her more than he should have. Not to monitor, but to understand. He saw how she paused to adjust the tablecloth so the pattern aligned with the edge, how she smiled just barely when sunlight hit the stained glass window in the east corridor, how she moved through the house as if every object mattered, how even when no one was watching, she still acted like someone was, not out of fear but pride. And he began to wonder what it had cost her to stay invisible so long, what it cost her now to be seen, and whether he had ever truly seen anyone at all. The following week unfolded like every other before it, at least on the surface. Breakfasts were served at precisely 7. The linens were changed every third day. The greenhouse was misted in the late afternoons, and the east hallway's stained glass window still cast its fractured light across the floor at exactly 3:47 p.m. But for Frederick, the hours had begun to carry weight. He moved through the house with a strange sort of alertness, as if watching his own life from a few feet outside it. He saw Naomi more now, not because she was any less discreet, but because he had learned where to look. She remained as composed as ever, her uniform crisp, her presence seamless. Yet there were moments when her humanity pierced through the routine, the way she closed her eyes briefly as she passed the piano, or how she paused by the door to the library as if pulled by something she would not allow herself to touch. The quiet rituals of her day, once invisible, now seemed like deliberate choices, signs of someone shaping a life within the boundaries she had been given. And slowly Frederick began to question the boundaries he had drawn around his own. It was another late night, or rather early morning, when he saw her again. This time she wasn't in the kitchen. He found her in the laundry corridor, or crouched beside a rolling cart, a thick medical textbook splayed open across her knees, its spine curved with use. A reading lamp clipped to the shelf above cast a dim halo over her head, highlighting the lines of exhaustion etched into her face. Her lips moved silently, mouthing diagnostic terms with slow, precise cadence, her index finger following the diagram of a digestive tract, as if tracing something sacred. He didn't make a sound, not at first. He simply watched, and when she finally looked up, she didn't flinch. She met his gaze squarely, calmly. There was fatigue in her eyes, but no apology, only a flicker of acknowledgement, then stillness. "I didn't mean to," she began, her voice quiet, steady. "It's all right," he interrupted, not unkindly. "You're not in trouble." She nodded once, her hands resting protectively over the open book. He stepped closer, not too close, and glanced at the page. Then, almost before he realized he was asking, the question came. "May I ask, what drives you?" She didn't answer right away. Her hands tightened slightly, her shoulders stiffened. Then she exhaled through her nose, as if releasing something held for too long. "When I was 10, she said softly, "my father collapsed on our porch. It took the ambulance 47 minutes to arrive. By then, he was gone." Her voice didn't waver, but the words landed heavy. "We lived in a town with no clinic, no doctor, just a pharmacy that closed at 5. We couldn't afford to drive him anywhere, and even if we could, we wouldn't have known where to go." She looked down at the book again. "I sat next to him while he apologized, over and over, for dying, for not being able to provide. I swore I'd never feel that helpless again." Frederick didn't speak. He couldn't. Her words dragged something up from beneath his ribs, something old and familiar and sharp. He leaned slightly against the doorframe, steadying himself. "My wife," he said after a long pause, "had stomach cancer. She didn't tell me. She thought it was indigestion stress, or maybe she didn't want to be a burden. By the time I realized it wasn't going away, it was already terminal." His voice was low, distant. "She died quietly. In this house. I missed it happening. I was in Zurich closing a deal." Naomi didn't respond, not with words, but she looked at him not as an employee, not as someone waiting to be dismissed, but as a person witnessing the kind of sorrow that leaves no bruise but never fades. And in that silence, something between them shifted again, not toward familiarity, not yet, but toward something deeper, a recognition of pain worn like armor, grief carried as structure. Frederick straightened slowly. He didn't thank her for sharing, didn't offer comfort. Instead, he nodded once, then turned and walked away. But his steps were slower now. He didn't return to his room. He went to the study where the fire had long since gone out and stood staring at the empty hearth as if it held answers. After a long time, he sat at his desk, turned on the small reading lamp, and opened his laptop. The email to his lawyer was brief, clinical. A request to draft the founding documents for a private scholarship fund. Anonymous, irrevocable, tied to a university extension program in the state. Tuition and materials covered, plus a modest living stipend. No name associated with the donation, no traceable connection. He typed the name of the fund last, the Eleanor Grace Trust. He didn't think about it, didn't hesitate. His fingers typed it before his mind could protest. He hit send. The next morning, he read the paper as usual, drank his coffee as usual, but when Naomi passed by the breakfast room, he looked up and watched her. Just for a second. She didn't notice. She was carrying a vase of fresh lilies, white and still dewy. He remembered Eleanor used to say that lilies smelled like endings. Naomi arranged them on the console table, adjusted one stem that leaned too far to the left, then disappeared back down the hallway. He watched the petals tremble slightly in the breeze from the air duct. They didn't smell like endings anymore. He didn't tell her about the scholarship. He wouldn't. That wasn't the point. He didn't want thanks or acknowledgement. He didn't even want her to know. But he had never in his life done something for one person without it benefiting a boardroom, a portfolio, or a name etched into the lobby of a building. And now that he felt not pride, but something harder to place. A quiet steadiness, the sense of having done something that mattered not in theory, but in reality. Something small, but real. That night, he passed the kitchen again. The light was off this time. No papers, no books, no rustling. The silence returned, but it no longer felt hollow. It felt like soil freshly turned, ready for something to grow. He stood there for a moment, hand resting on the edge of the doorframe. Then he turned off the hall light and walked upstairs in the dark, not to escape, but simply because now he didn't need to see everything clearly to know where he was going. The letter arrived on a rainy Thursday, slipped beneath a stack of folded towels in Naomi's cubby by the laundry chute. It bore the seal of the university and her name in block print across a plain envelope. No frills, no handwritten note, nothing that betrayed emotion. She stared at it for a long moment, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the hum of the hallway light. Then quietly she folded the towels over the envelope again and walked away. She carried it tucked close to her chest, the way one carries something fragile and flammable, and when she finally reached her room, she sat at the edge of her cot and opened it with hands that trembled. The letter was brief, formal, factual. She had been accepted. The program was hers. Tuition materials, a modest stipend, all covered by a donor who had chosen to remain anonymous. She read the paragraph once, then again, and then a third time just to be sure the words would not change. Her eyes burned, but she did not cry. Not yet. For the rest of the day, she moved like a ghost through the house. She polished silver without looking at her reflection. She fluffed cushions she no longer saw. She responded to the cook's quiet greeting with a nod so mechanical it felt borrowed from someone else's face. Because beneath the euphoria of being seen, of being chosen, something colder coiled in her chest, the reality that followed. To join the program, even online, meant time. Time for lectures, for labs, for exams. Time she currently spent scrubbing baseboards, inventorying pantry goods, steaming curtains. The stipend would cover rent, barely. It would not stretch to her mother's medication. It would not cover Ben's school fees or Mari's shoes. It would not pay for the electricity that powered the old box fan back home in Baton Rouge. And if she asked to reduce her hours at the estate, she risked losing everything that kept them afloat. The dream, suddenly tangible, had arrived with a price she had no currency to pay. That night, Frederick noticed the difference. Naomi moved through her duties with precision, but no presence. Her answers were short, her eyes lowered, her footsteps muffled not by effort, but by absence. He saw it in the way she paused a moment too long before setting down a tray, how her shoulders sagged ever so slightly when she thought no one watched. The sliver of light beneath the kitchen door did not appear. No pages rustled in the dark. No whisper of Latin terms floated into the hallway. The silence, once full of purpose, now felt empty again. And he understood. She had received the letter, and she was preparing not to follow it. Later that evening, he found himself lingering near the back hallway that led to the service rooms. He stood by her door, hand lifted to knock, then let it fall. This was not his moment to claim. He turned and walked instead to the greenhouse, the scent of wet earth and jasmine grounding him. He sat on the bench beneath the ferns, the same one where Eleanor had once leaned her head against his shoulder and said, "Nothing real grows without tension." He remembered how he hadn't understood her then. He did now. The next morning, Naomi appeared at his study door. She had never come to him directly before. She stood with a thin manila envelope in her hands, eyes calm but unreadable. "I'd like to speak with you, Mr. Harlow," she said quietly. He looked up from the financial journal on his desk, the one he hadn't truly been reading, and nodded toward the chairs near the window. She sat gingerly, the envelope pressed flat against her lap, her fingers still. "I received an acceptance letter," she began. "From the university." He inclined his head, keeping his expression neutral. "That's wonderful." She nodded once. "There's a scholarship, anonymous donor, full tuition, monthly support." Then after a pause, she looked directly at him, her voice sharper. "Was it you?" He met her eyes. There was no point in evasion. "Yes," he said simply. She exhaled not with relief, but with the controlled composure of someone letting go of a truth they'd carried too long. Her grip on the envelope loosened slightly, her shoulders relaxing by degrees. "I'm grateful," she said after a moment. "Truly, but I don't think I can accept it." The silence that followed was different from the usual hush of Langford Hall. It felt thick, inhabited, dense, with everything unsaid. Frederick sat back slightly, his fingers steepled. Why? Because it's not just about me, she said, her voice steady. My family depends on my job here. I send money home every week. My mother needs medication. My siblings are still in school. If I step back from work, even part-time, they lose everything I help provide. I can't be selfish. He stood, then slowly walked a few steps toward the window, then turned back. His voice was low, careful. What you call selfishness, I would call courage. She shook her head gently but firmly. They need me more than the world needs another doctor. He stepped closer, not looming, just present. Naomi, he said softer now, you've spent your life giving. To your family, to this house, to a world that rarely gives anything back. If you give up this dream for survival, you'll keep surviving. But you'll never live. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. I'm not asking you to understand. I already do, he replied. I lost my wife because I assumed she would always tell me when something mattered, because I didn't listen until it was too late. This isn't charity, it's choice, and it's yours. She stared at him for a long moment, then slowly placed the envelope on the low table between them. I've never heard anyone say that to me before, she whispered. Not once. I mean it, he said. The room grew still again, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt expectant. Naomi lowered her gaze, her voice small but unwavering. I don't know what to do. You do, he said gently. You've just never had permission to believe it. She looked at him again, and for the first time he saw not the young woman who ironed his shirts or mopped the marble floor, but the girl who had once knelt beside her dying father, who had whispered promises into his silence and turned those promises into flashcards and late nights and diagrams of organs no one else believed she could understand. The girl who had become a woman in the shadows, and now stood in the light, unsure if she was allowed to stay. They sat in silence, the envelope between them like a fragile bridge. At last she nodded slowly, but with something solid beneath the motion. I'll try, she said. I don't know how yet, but I'll try. A breath escaped him that he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't need to. The look they exchanged said enough. It was not permission. It was not rescue. It was recognition. The kind that changes everything. That night, Naomi packed her uniforms with shaking hands, not out of fear but determination. In her room, she folded her books into a borrowed satchel and taped a photograph of her siblings beside her cot. Then she whispered a promise into the stillness. She was not walking away. She was stepping forward, and for the first time, the house did not feel like something she was leaving behind. It felt like the place where she had first been seen. Naomi stepped off the bus with a backpack slung over one shoulder and a thin folder of documents clutched tightly in her hands. The city loomed around her, not with menace, but with a kind of indifference she could feel in her bones. People moved in tight clusters or alone with purpose, their heads bent to phones, their conversations clipped their shoes cleaner than hers. The sidewalks were uneven, in places slick from the morning drizzle. She had memorized the address twice and stared at the photo of the student housing building long enough to recognize its crooked awning, even in real life. The building wasn't beautiful. It was squat brick and clearly aging, but it stood. That, she thought, was enough. Her room was small, no larger than the linen closet she had once scrubbed at Langford Hall. The mattress dipped in the middle, and the desk wobbled when she placed her laptop, Frederick's anonymous gift, on top of it. But it had a window that looked out over a fire escape, and when the breeze was right, she could hear someone playing jazz 3 floors down. She hung one photo above her desk, her siblings Mari and Ben, both grinning with the gap-toothed pride of kids who didn't yet know how heavy the world could be. She taped her acceptance letter beside it, not as proof, but as anchor. She would need something to hold on to when it got hard. And it would. The first day of orientation felt like walking into a foreign country where she didn't speak the language. The hall buzzed with voices, most of them younger, sharper, easier with space. Students spilled across the lobby in bright clothes and expensive sneakers, their backpacks monogrammed, their laptops thin and gleaming. She wore the same sweater she had used to study in, at night sleeves slightly frayed at the cuffs, and shoes she had scrubbed until her knuckles bled. No one looked at her, not unkindly. They simply didn't see her. Oh, sure. She wasn't part of their map. In the lecture halls, she sat in the front row because she couldn't afford to miss a word. Her notebook filled fast, long pages of cramped handwriting arrows, color-coded tabs she had labeled the night before. When other students asked questions, they laughed when they didn't know the answer. Naomi didn't laugh. She listened. She memorized. She came early and left last. In the evenings, her apartment stayed lit until the small hours. She studied with the window cracked open and her elbows pressed into the desk. The stipend covered rent and groceries barely. Anything extra she earned from tutoring other students online went straight home. Her mother's prescriptions arrived in padded mailers now paid for in full. Mari had new shoes. Ben had a used tablet for school. She wrote them letters she didn't always send and whispered their names before she slept like a benediction. Still, the doubt came. It didn't announce itself loudly. It arrived in quiet moments, the way someone glanced past her during a lab, the awkward silence when she raised her hand too quickly, the professor who asked, kindly but mistakenly, if she was part of the adult learning program. There were days she didn't speak to anyone outside of lectures. She ate lunch on a bench beneath a maple tree that turned gold too early in the season and watched groups of students form around each other with ease she'd never known. She had earned her place here, but she didn't feel it yet. She didn't feel anything but tired. Then came the immunology seminar. It was a Wednesday gray and too humid. The professor, a woman with a clipped accent and a reputation for brutal case studies, projected a set of symptoms on the screen, ambiguous overlapping meant to confound. Diagnosis, she asked the room. Silence. Pages flipped. Pens hovered. Naomi stared at the data: fever, eczema, recurrent lung infections. It prickled something in her memory. She had read about this, not in class. In the supplemental reading she'd chased down after a long night of confusion. She raised her hand, slowly unsure. Yes, the professor said. Naomi cleared her throat. It resembles a rare variant of hyper-IgE syndrome, Jobs syndrome. It's immunodeficiency with connective tissue involvement. There's a paper Dr. Tatarian from 2016. It outlined a case with nearly identical markers. The room stayed quiet. The professor blinked once, then nodded. Correct. Very well done. A few heads turned. For the first time, someone asked her name. It wasn't a victory, not fully, but it cracked something open. That week, 2 classmates approached her after lab to ask if she wanted to form a study group. Another left a post-it on her desk with a simple message. Thanks for what you said in class. Helped me understand the enzyme issue. Naomi didn't smile, but she felt something shift, less like belonging, more like oxygen. Like the air had changed pressure just enough to make breathing feel less like labor. Back at Langford Hall, the house ran as always. Floors gleamed, clocks ticked, staff moved like choreography. But Frederick read less and wandered more. He had taken to sitting in the study long after the sun went down, the only light coming from the desk lamp. He checked the mail himself now, something he had never done. One afternoon, nestled between a financial statement and a note from the legal office, there was a white envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, unlined, written in the slanted script he remembered from the notebook on his kitchen counter months before. It was unsigned. I'm here. It's overwhelming. I feel like I've stepped into a world that doesn't know what to do with someone like me, but I'm still walking, still trying. Thank you for giving me the space to begin. He read it 3 times. Then he pinned it to the corkboard above the bookshelf. A week later, another arrived. Then another. No names, no dates. Just quiet updates, fragments of a life being built brick by brick. He never wrote back. That would have made it about him. But he made sure the Eleanor Grace Trust was renewed early, with a little more allocated to general student support. A second scholarship appeared 2 months later, labeled as a diversity initiative, funded by anonymous donation. A laptop was delivered to Naomi's building, faster processor, better battery life. It came with no note, just a slip of paper for long nights and harder questions. She never mentioned it, but she began writing more often. In the estate, no one asked about the letters on the wall. Visitors assumed they were memos or personal reflections. But Frederick knew. Each letter was a heartbeat, a reminder that somewhere beyond the iron gates, something he had done had taken root. He began attending board meetings less frequently, donated more, quietly, always. He agreed to fund a community health clinic proposal in a district he had never set foot in. No ribbon cutting, no name on the wall, just funds and silence. The kind of silence that builds rather than erases. One crisp October morning, he stood by the window watching the trees turn. A new envelope lay unopened on his desk. The fire crackled softly behind him. Outside, the wind moved through the garden, shaking loose the last of the summer's petals. He closed his eyes and listened. Somewhere far from this house, in a room with fluorescent lights and plastic chairs, Naomi was sitting at a desk answering a question no one expected her to know. Somewhere, she was making space, not asking for permission, taking it. And for the first time in his life, Frederick understood what it meant to give without condition, to believe in someone not because they had earned it, but because they needed it, because they would not waste it, because sometimes faith was not a leap. Sometimes it was a quiet, continuous act, a page turned, a letter mailed, a life remade. The second semester came with a sharper wind, one that pressed against Naomi's cheeks and whispered a constant reminder that progress had a price. By now, she had settled into a rhythm, morning lectures, lab work, tutoring in the evenings, studying until her eyes blurred. Her apartment was still bare, but it felt less like a temporary shelter and more like a space she had earned. The neighbors no longer stared when she passed. One even offered to water her plants when she mentioned her finals. It was a small thing, but it meant something. Still, despite the steadiness she had begun to carve into her days, there were moments when the weight of other people's perceptions fell like lead. It happened in subtle ways, a group project where her suggestions were ignored until repeated by someone else, a professor who double-checked her citations more than anyone else's, a classmate who asked if she was on a special access track. Once in the middle of a discussion on clinical ethics, someone casually said, "People like you don't usually get into this program unless there's some story attached," as if her presence needed a narrative beyond merit. Naomi didn't argue. She let the words land, but she never let them stay. Instead, she folded them neatly and stored them in the same compartment where she kept every other reason to keep going: her mother's voice on the phone, Ben's school report, Mari's drawing on the fridge, and the letters she never signed but sent anyway, the ones that always began the same way: "Still walking." Then came the announcement the university was launching a new mentorship initiative for incoming international and first-generation students. The application process was quiet, almost hidden behind other emails and bulletin board notices. Naomi applied without telling anyone. Her interview lasted 17 minutes. She thought she had said too little. A week later, she was selected. The first group of mentees arrived with wide eyes and uneven English. Some wore jackets too thin for the weather, others carried backpacks that looked borrowed. Naomi met each of them with the same steady presence she had once relied on in the dark corners of Langford Hall. She spoke clearly, listened more, and when they asked if she had been nervous too, she simply nodded. She didn't give speeches. She gave tools: how to structure study schedules, where to get affordable textbooks, which professors to avoid when tired. And slowly they leaned into her, not as a leader, but as proof. She wasn't polished, but she had survived, and survival, they realized, was its own kind of credential. That month, Naomi received a certificate of academic excellence. She hadn't known she was being considered. The award came in a simple folder with embossed lettering. She tucked it in her desk drawer, not out of modesty, but because the work it represented was still ongoing. Along with the certificate came a request. Would she be willing to share her experience at a closed faculty session on student resilience? She said yes, then rewrote her notes 4 times. When the day came, she stood in front of a semicircle of seasoned faculty and spoke not of hardship, but of process, of hours spent not understanding until one sentence clicked, of reading chapters twice because she didn't trust she had earned the knowledge the first time, of walking into rooms where no one looked like her and staying anyway. When she finished, no one applauded, but 3 professors approached her quietly afterward. One asked for permission to quote her in a grant proposal. Another offered lab access over the summer. The third simply said, "Thank you, I needed to hear that." That night, she wrote another letter. It was short, like all the others. "I didn't think I had anything to offer, but maybe what I've carried can become a map for someone else. Still walking." At Langford Hall, Frederick read the letter under the same lamplight where he had once signed quarterly reports with surgical precision. He pinned this one near the center of the board. The wall was nearly full now, a quiet mosaic of belief. He didn't need the words to be eloquent. It was their constancy that mattered. Each letter proved the light he had once turned on had not gone out. He no longer read the financial pages first. He started his mornings with the letters. They made the house feel less like a monument to stillness and more like a place where something had begun, then continued far beyond its gates. Sometimes he imagined Naomi in her study space surrounded by textbooks and printouts explaining kidney function to a student who had only recently learned to conjugate in English. He imagined her hands, the ones that once folded linen with ritualistic care, now gesturing with certainty over charts and notes. She had changed, yes, but not in essence. The girl who had whispered medical terms at midnight had not become someone else. She had become more of herself. And in doing so, had given him something he had not known he needed, the knowledge that it was not too late to be part of something meaningful. Frederick didn't reply to the letters. He never would. That was not the arrangement. But one afternoon, he sent a check to the university marked for the mentorship program's expansion. No name, no mention, just belief. He understood now that belief, when given freely, could travel further than intention, that it didn't require recognition to have impact. It only needed continuity. Like the scratch of pen against paper, like a girl who kept walking. And Naomi did. Through midterms and rotations and the long, thin winter that made the city feel like bone. She did not forget the moments she had been doubted. She did not erase the comments or the stares or the professors who still asked, "Where did you transfer from again?" But she no longer carried them as wounds. She carried them as proof that she had climbed. And when the students she mentored stumbled, she didn't offer them pity. She offered them structure. She offered them truth, that it would be hard, that they would feel alone, that they might not be chosen, but they could still choose to continue. And each night, after the campus went quiet and the buses ran less often, Naomi would return to her room, heat up leftovers she barely tasted, open her books, and keep going, because someone had once turned on a light, and because she had promised, in every word she had written, that she would not stop until the path she was on was wide enough for someone else to follow. The night the ambulance pulled up to the ER dock with no sirens and too few answers, Naomi was midway through, charting the vitals of a woman recovering from a minor stroke. The hospital was understaffed as usual, and the fluorescent lights cast the kind of sterile, ghost-like pallor over everything that made even the living seem half dead. She had learned by now that most miracles didn't look like anything special at first. They usually arrived in silence or in the hands of someone scared. That night, it was a man in a frayed jacket soaking wet from the rain, holding the limp body of a girl no older than 7, her head lolled against his shoulder, her skin and ashen gray lips tinged faint blue. The front desk nurse asked about insurance. The man shook his head. He didn't speak much English. Something about the shelter down the street. Something about her collapsing an hour ago. No ID. No parent present. No paperwork. A social worker had already gone home for the night. The on-call attending physician frowned, citing protocol. Naomi could hear the decision forming in the silence stabilized document transfer. They were waiting for authorization. And in the space between waiting and acting, a child was dying. Naomi didn't ask permission. She crossed the room, scooped the girl from the man's arms, and laid her on a rolling stretcher. Her hands moved fast, checking airway pulse pupils. She called for epinephrine for oxygen, snapped orders in a voice she barely recognized as her own. A nurse moved to stop her, hesitated, then obeyed. For a moment, the whole room stilled. Naomi barked a code and pushed the stretcher toward the trauma bay. The attending shouted her name, but she didn't turn back. She had made the choice. Not because she was certain, but because she could not do nothing. The girl had gone into respiratory arrest. Naomi administered the dose herself, monitored vitals, called out numbers, as if she had done it 1,000 times, when in truth it was her first solo trauma response. When the girl finally coughed, sharp and wet, and color began to bleed back into her cheeks, Naomi gripped the edge of the stretcher so tightly her knuckles cracked. A nurse behind her let out a quiet, involuntary sound, somewhere between a sob and a prayer. The attending arrived seconds later, gloves already on, face unreadable. He didn't say anything. He just took over. Naomi stepped back, chest heaving, her scrubs soaked with sweat. She knew what would come next. The review board met the following morning. She was called in before her shift ended. The attending, to his credit, didn't throw her under the bus, but protocol had been breached. Liability was cited. Hospital policy reviewed. Naomi stood still in her chair, back straight, answering every question clearly. She did not apologize. She did not plead. When asked why she acted without consent, she said, "Because she was dying and we were waiting for a form." They let her go with a warning. No suspension, no reprimand filed. It was the most grace she could expect. She walked out of the room with her badge still clipped to her collar and her spine intact. 2 nights later, a post appeared on a regional healthcare forum. A nurse had written it anonymously. The story wasn't dramatic. It was short, just a recounting. But the final line struck. We wait so often for someone to take responsibility. That night, a student did, and a child lived. Within 48 hours, the post had been shared over 1,000 times. A local paper picked it up, then another. By the weekend, a journalist tracked down the ER shift log and confirmed the name of the intern, Naomi Ellis. The headline read, "Medical intern steps in when no one else would." Naomi didn't know about the article until a classmate brought it to her the following Monday, eyes wide with admiration. She read the piece in the hallway backpack, still slung over one shoulder, hand trembling slightly. There was no photo, just her name and a quote from the nurse. She moved like she'd done it before, but we all knew she hadn't. That night, in the quiet of her apartment, Naomi opened her notebook. She stared at a blank page, unsure of what to write. Then slowly, deliberately, she put pen to paper. I didn't freeze. I acted. I may never forget that moment because it reminded me why I began. Not to be seen, not to be thanked, but because someone once died on a porch with no one to help. I want to be the person who never waits. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the envelope with no return address. She knew it would find its way. At Langford Hall, the days were shorter now. Winter had crept over the grounds with its usual hush. Frederick read the letter by the light of the fireplace, his hand resting lightly on the paper. He did not smile, but he felt something in his chest settle the way a stone settles at the bottom of a pond, not heavy but certain. He pinned the letter beneath the one about the mentorship program. Then he stepped back and looked at the wall. So many letters now, so many pieces of a life being built with quiet insistence. He found the article the next morning. It had made its way to the National Syndicate. He read it once, then printed a copy and slid it into the drawer beneath his watch collection, for safekeeping, for memory. He did not call the university. He did not send flowers. But later that week, a check cleared for the Pediatric Trauma Fund, unsolicited, anonymous, large enough to train 5 interns for the next 3 years, because belief he had learned was not about control. It was about release. And Naomi had become exactly what he had always hoped she could be. Not a symbol, not a miracle, just someone who knew when to move. The knock came just past noon on a Friday, soft and hesitant, like the hand behind it wasn't sure whether to knock at all. Naomi was in the staff lounge, half asleep, beside a cup of vending machine coffee she hadn't touched. Her shift just ended after back-to-back emergency admits and 6 hours of patient rounds. Her name had just started to circulate in hallways she used to walk through unnoticed. Some nodded now when they passed her. Some asked questions like she might have an answer. But at the core, Naomi hadn't changed. She still came early, still left late, still walked home under the same sky that hadn't yet decided if spring had really come. When the nurse peeked in and said, "You have visitors," Naomi blinked. No one ever came here for her. She smoothed her scrubs out of habit and walked toward the reception desk with the wary curiosity of someone approaching a memory that might disappear if touched too directly. But they were there. Her mother Althea standing upright with her best Sunday blouse, one she hadn't worn since Naomi graduated high school. Her younger sister Mari, now 15, and taller than Naomi remembered, clutching a folded newspaper in one hand and a tote bag that looked too heavy for her frame. And Ben, the youngest, holding a juice box in one hand, and a look in his eyes Naomi couldn't quite name, a mix of awe and distance, like he was meeting a version of his sister he only half recognized. They didn't say much at first. Althea stepped forward and wrapped Naomi in a hug that was firm but shaking slightly. No tears, just presence, just breath. When they stepped back, Althea looked at her daughter for a long, silent moment, then touched her cheek with a callous thumb. "You look like you sleep even less than I do," she said, the corner of her mouth twitching up. Naomi laughed, once quiet and sharp, like she'd forgotten how. Mari stepped up and held out the paper, the one with the article, the one Naomi had avoided rereading. The picture wasn't there, but her name was bold against the grainy black and white. "Miss Rivera printed it for me at school," Mari said. "I wanted to keep it." They sat together in a corner of the lounge for a while. Naomi made tea with the hot water machine. Ben tried on her stethoscope and declared her job cooler than video games. Althea listened more than she spoke, her eyes drifting often to her daughter's face as if trying to reconcile the woman in front of her with the girl who once patched up a neighbor's cat using a shoelace and a cotton ball. Naomi talked about the ward, the patients, the hours carefully omitting the exhaustion, the doubt, the moments she still felt like she was pretending. But mothers know. When she paused too long between sentences, Althea reached over and placed her hand over Naomi's. "We see you," she said. "We've always seen you." Later, walking them out to the sidewalk, Naomi asked how they got there. She hadn't expected them. Bus fare was expensive. Time was tight. "A woman at the church helped us," Althea said. "And someone paid for the hotel. Said it was handled already. No name. Just a letter at the desk. Said, 'You deserve to see her.'" Naomi stopped walking. A soft wind stirred her curls and she closed her eyes for a breath. She didn't need to guess. The handwriting wasn't there. The voice wasn't either, but she knew. It had the same shape as every anonymous envelope, the same silence that said more than most words. Frederick. She hadn't written to him in weeks, not out of forgetfulness, but out of reverence. She didn't know how to put her life now into the small space of a letter without it feeling incomplete. But that night, after her family had gone, after she'd returned to her apartment and taken off her badge, she sat at her desk and began again. They came today. My mother, my siblings. I don't know how you knew, but you always seemed to. I didn't know how much I needed to be seen through their eyes again, not as a student or a headline, but as the person they still believe in. Thank you for that. I don't know if I've earned all this. I still make mistakes. I still forget things. I still doubt. But I don't freeze. I keep going. You taught me that whether you meant to or not. I don't have a name for what we are to each other, but I carry your belief like a second spine. She folded the letter, sealed it, and sent it the next morning. She didn't need to wait for a reply. At Langford Hall, the staff had grown used to seeing Frederick in the study at odd hours, often standing in front of the cork wall, as if in silent conversation. When the letter arrived, he opened it at his desk beneath the same window where Eleanor once stood, planting ivy into clay pots. He read it slowly, twice. Then, without a word, he reached for the smallest brass tack and pinned it in the upper right-hand corner of the board. It was the only one that sat apart from the grid, as if he knew somehow it didn't belong to the past. It was a door to whatever came next. Outside, a storm was rolling in over the ridge. The air buzzed faintly with electricity, but in the room, everything was still. Still and alive with the memory of a girl who once studied under kitchen light and the echo of a promise neither of them had ever needed to speak aloud, because it had already been kept. The air in Queens was different, thicker, closer to the ground. It didn't roll in soft breezes like the fields around Langford Hall. It pressed in with the hum of traffic, the scent of hot pavement, and corner food carts, the distant music bleeding from windows, cracked just enough to let the day escape. Naomi had chosen this place not for what it had, but for what it lacked, what it needed. It had taken months of grant-writing city permits, late-night calls to health boards and landlords. She had filled out more forms than she'd written pages in her final exams. But in the end, the keys were hers. The clinic stood on a quiet block tucked between a shuttered laundromat and a row of aging townhouses. Its brick faded, its windows uneven, but its door freshly painted a soft, steady blue. Inside, the walls were clean, the floors scrubbed, and the reception desk bore a small wooden sign, Humana Clinic. Everyone welcome. No questions asked. She opened on a Tuesday. No ribbon, no cameras. Just a folding table with a tray of granola bars, a stack of intake forms, and a sign-in sheet. The first patient arrived at 8:12 a.m., a boy with a hacking cough and a nervous aunt who spoke only Spanish. Naomi took the history herself, asked permission, in soft practice phrases, listened to his lungs, wrote a prescription. By noon, she had seen 5 more, an elderly woman with chronic pain, a construction worker with untreated hypertension, a young mother terrified her toddler's rash was something worse. Naomi moved room to room, clipboard in hand, coat clean, but already creased at the elbows. Her team was small, 2 part-time nurses, a volunteer receptionist studying for her GED, and Dr. Bennett, a retired general practitioner who offered 2 days a week and stories from 40 years in medicine. By Thursday, the waiting room was full by 10 a.m. Word had spread. No insurance. Didn't matter. No ID, no problem. Naomi made room. She saw everyone. She remembered every name. She stayed past sunset, scribbling notes, cleaning surfaces, answering voicemails from patients, too afraid to come in, but brave enough to call. At night, she fell into sleep without brushing her hair, her stethoscope still slung over the chair. It was a week into the clinic's opening when he came. She didn't see him at first. The reception desk had been overtaken by a stack of donated pediatric vaccines, and she was arguing quietly with the delivery man about a back-ordered box of gauze. It was the silence that caught her Dr. Bennett's voice, stopping mid-sentence, the receptionist standing a little straighter. Naomi turned and saw him standing just inside the doorway, framed by the glass and late afternoon sun. Frederick. He looked smaller than she remembered, though he stood just as straight. His coat was long, dark, and unbranded, the kind that wealth wears without needing labels. His hair had silvered further, his eyes still clear. He said nothing at first, just looked. Not at her, but around at the peeling corners of the check-in desk, the hum of the cheap AC unit, the child swinging her feet off the waiting bench. Then he looked at her. She crossed the room slowly, the way someone does when they're approaching not a person, but a memory made flesh. When she reached him, she didn't offer a handshake. She just said, "I didn't think you'd come." Frederick's mouth curved slightly, a smile not yet formed. "Neither did I," he said, "but I was nearby." They stepped outside onto the bench beside the mural that covered the wall adjacent to the clinic. Children in bright clothes holding hands beneath a sky of impossible blue. Naomi sat. He did too. They didn't speak for a while. The city moved around them, a blur of movement and noise that made the silence between them feel earned. Finally, she said, "I wanted to build something that stayed. Not just help, but stay." He nodded once. "And you have." Naomi turned, slightly searching his face. "Do you ever think about that night in the kitchen?" "Every day," he said. "Not because of what I saw, but because of what I failed to see before that." She exhaled slow and steady. "I almost stopped. After the letters, after med school, there were moments." Her voice faded. He waited. She continued, "But you were always there. Not loudly, just there." Frederick looked ahead. "That's how belief works. You don't shout it. You just refuse to leave." They sat in the lengthening shadow of the building. Naomi brushed her fingers against the bench edge. "I used to think success would feel like applause, but it feels more like this. Work, quiet, necessary." Frederick smiled now, soft and full. "You've redefined what legacy means." "So have you," she said. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small envelope, handed it to her without flourish. "From Langford," he said. "A little seed money for your next idea." She didn't open it. She didn't have to. "Thank you," she said, voice low. "But this clinic, it's not because of the money. It's because you made me feel seen when I didn't even know I was invisible." Frederick looked at her, and for the first time she saw in him not a benefactor, but a man humbled by what he'd witnessed. "It's always been yours, Naomi. I just kept the light on until you were ready to carry it." They stood together as the sky deepened. He placed a hand briefly over hers. "Keep the light on," he said. She smiled. "I always do." Then he turned and walked away. Not slow, not fast, just steady. Naomi watched until he turned the corner and disappeared into the rhythm of the city. Then she stepped back inside the clinic where the next patient waited, and the future she had built, room by room, heartbeat by heartbeat, kept unfolding in quiet, insistent grace. It had been 14 months since the Humana Clinic opened its doors, and still Naomi found herself surprised by the rhythm it created, the kind that didn't hum in straight lines but bent like breath, rising and falling with every new name on the intake sheet. Some days were slow, filled with coughs and checkups and questions that began with, "Is this normal?" Other days moved like storms, fast, disorienting, relentless. But through it all, she remained steady, not because she had grown used to the chaos, but because she had learned how to live inside it. She had built this place not to conquer suffering, but to hold it. She knew she couldn't save everyone, but she could see them, and for many, that was the beginning. One Tuesday morning, while sorting mail at the end of her shift, Naomi noticed an envelope tucked between a batch of supply invoices and a local clinic newsletter. No return address. Childlike handwriting. She opened it carefully, unfolding a single page of lined paper. Inside was a short note written in bright purple ink. "Dear Dr. Naomi, thank you for helping me when I was sick. I'm better now. I want to be a doctor just like you. When I grow up, I want to make people feel safe like you do. My mom says you are magic. I think so too. Love, Lucia, the one with the blue backpack." Naomi stood still in the hallway, the letter open in her hand. She remembered Lucia small, shy, barely speaking above a whisper, her lungs tight with asthma, and her cheeks flushed with fever. Naomi had held her hand through the nebulizer treatment, drawn a bunny on her prescription note, just to make her laugh. She hadn't thought about it since, but Lucia had. She carried the letter into her office and pinned it to the wall beside her desk. The wall had once been bare, a plain space in a borrowed room. Now it held stories, thank you notes in every language, scribbled drawings, a copy of her first medical license, a photo of her family from their visit last year, all of them standing in the hallway of the clinic, Mary grinning too wide, Ben holding a juice box like a trophy. And just above all that, framed in soft gold, was a printed version of one of her own letters, the one that had said, "I want to be the person who never waits." That afternoon, she saw patients until the sun dipped low and the sky turned the color of cool dash. She wrapped up a follow-up visit with a man who'd gone months without insulin, filed his refill paperwork, and turned off the exam room light. Her body ached in familiar ways. Her feet throbbed, but she felt good, grounded, as if every moment of her past life had led precisely to this one. The clinic emptied slowly. Dr. Bennett had already left, as had the nurses. The receptionist waved goodbye through the front glass. Naomi stood alone at the counter, organizing charts, when she noticed something wedged behind the mailbox. It was a slip of paper torn from a notepad. No envelope, just one sentence written in rushed, messy script. "Thank you for being here." She didn't know who left it. She didn't need to. She folded it gently and placed it next to Lucia's letter. It didn't matter that it wasn't signed. It mattered that someone had felt the need to say it. That was enough. Miles away, Langford Hall sat in its usual stillness. The ivy had climbed higher up the brick, and the garden had overgrown its perfect lines. Frederick no longer instructed the groundskeepers to trim with surgical precision. He let the wild things grow. It was a quiet rebellion, one he didn't advertise. Inside, the study had changed too. The corkboard had expanded. Where once there were just a few carefully preserved letters, now there was an entire wall covered in messages from Naomi. He read them in the evening when the house grew quiet and the world outside fell away. Some letters spoke of exhaustion, others of small victories, a patient who smiled, a child who learned to say thank you in English. Each one was its own kind of medicine. Frederick had learned to live inside the quiet she left behind, not as absence, but as resonance. He still didn't speak of her to many, but when someone asked what had changed him, he would pause, then say, "A girl once reminded me that belief is a discipline." He didn't need to say more. It was all there in the way he responded to people now, the way he gave, without needing credit, the way he had redefined his legacy, not in balance sheets, but in lives touched anonymously. On the anniversary of the clinic's opening, he sent no letter, no gift, just a single donation routed through the same anonymous channel as before. Attached to the wire was a one-line message, "In honor of those who stay." Naomi received it during her lunch break. She read the note once, then tucked it into her pocket. She didn't need a name. She had always known who it was from. That evening, she stayed later than usual. She sanitized counters, refilled tongue depressor jars, restocked gloves. The kind of mundane work that no one thanked her for, but that kept the place alive. When she stepped outside, the air was cool, tinged with autumn. She locked the door, turned off the outside light, then paused. She looked back at the building, the windows still faintly glowing from within the mural beside the door, catching the last of the fading light. For a moment, she stood still, keys in her hand, the city quiet around her. Then she whispered to no one in particular, "We're still here." And they were. Not just her, but every patient who had walked through the door and found someone willing to listen. Every nurse who had stayed past their shift to comfort a scared child. Every donor who had given quietly believing that kindness need not be seen to matter. Every person who had chosen to act instead of wait. Back at Langford, Frederick stood in the greenhouse watering a pot of late-blooming orchids. He did not know what Naomi had done that day, but he sensed, as he always had, that whatever it was, it had been done with care. He placed the watering can down, turned toward the house, and paused at the threshold. "Keep the light on," he said softly. And though she did not hear him, Naomi, miles away, turned on the bedside lamp in her apartment, opened her journal, and wrote a single line beneath the date. "The work is quiet, but it echoes." Outside, the streetlights blinked on, one by one. Somewhere, a child coughed. A nurse sighed. A mother exhaled relief. And in a small clinic between a laundromat and a row of worn brick homes, a promise kept burning not as fire, but as glow. gentle, steady, and unmistakably alive.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.